Hello, folks. Welcome to Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Today I want to discuss the topic of praxis. The word praxis comes from the same root as practice, and the definition is pretty similar. Often in academia, we talk about the interface between theory and praxis, meaning theory, which is defined in science, including in scientific socialism, as explanation, way of explaining the world, a way of making sense out of the world, and ideally a way of transforming the world as well. And praxis is the actual activity that one engages in order to enact one's theory. Living in the first world and being a Maoist third worldist, it makes it difficult to come up with concrete ways in which one can actually engage in praxis. I mean, what do? Well, I'm 3 miles from Mexico. I live in a very warm climate. We really only have 2 seasons. We have a long summer, which we're still in, a brief spring, and then we're back in the summer. There are no evergreen trees. I mean, there are only evergreen trees. So we really don't have a fall per se. It's just 2 seasons. That's it. And so that gives us opportunities to be outside, where in many parts of the world, in many parts of North America, that would be difficult. Well, I guess if you are a tough person, unlike myself, and you like being outside in the really, really cold weather, that might not be challenging. Me, I'm not like that. I guess I'm not so tough. In the winter, I tend to hibernate. Fortunately, here there is no winter. Now, that's not to say we don't have cold snaps. We do. But it's even those cold snaps, like 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not really. It's a warm climate. I am in the warmest county in the state of Texas, Hidalgo County. We are on the same latitude as Miami, Florida. So it's warm. It's very warm here. It's in the 90s today. There are all sorts of praxis that I can think of engaging in. One, I'll mention first, is Antifa, however you want to say it. But it's not Antifa. That is Donald Trump's pronunciation. Now, ordinarily, I could care less how people pronounce things. Who cares? But in this case, it genuinely matters. Because if I say I'm into Antifa, who in the world is going to know what I'm talking about? Antifa is like a meaningless collection of 2 syllables. If, on the other hand, I say I'm Antifa, then it's easier to figure out that by Antifa I mean anti-fascism, which is actually what Antifa is an acronym for. It's an acronym for anti-fascism. In German, it's similar. In German, they pronounce it Antifa. But it's the same basic thing. It's anti-fascism. And by calling it Antifa in English, it makes more sense and people can understand right away what it is that you're talking about. Antifa is sometimes used, at least in the US, in a very watered down way. There are a lot of people who are not really committed communists, who call themselves Antifa, and if somebody says I'm Antifa, then you know right away that person has no idea of what she or he is talking about. And basically all they do, they like to play dress up, I think, sometimes. Or some of the more immature ones go up to people that they at least think are Nazis and they punch them in the face. Yeah, they've really accomplished a lot. That really does a lot of good, punching somebody in the face. You really have worked to benefit the cause of anti-fascism. In all seriousness, being anti-fa means that you are interested in fighting fascism. And fascism is defined by most people in Antifa as in a very broad way, much broader than most people define it. For example, I would say that in the US, both the Republican and Democratic parties are fascist or quasi-fascist. Certainly MAGA is fascist. Trump himself is a fascist. Classically, if you go back to Mussolini, the guy who actually developed fascism, he used it in a much more narrow sense. Hitler was originally a student of Mussolini's, which a lot of people don't know. Hitler developed Nazism based upon his study of Mussolini's fascism. Now, he did not coin the word Nazism. The word Nazism existed before National Socialism. That existed prior to Hitler's adaptation of the term. The only reason why Hitler agreed to continue using the term Nazism is because he redefined socialism as German nationalism, which is not, it doesn't really make much sense to me, but I guess it made sense to him. Hitler was not a socialist. So referring to Nazism as National Socialism, while technically I guess it's correct, it's misleading because Hitler was not a socialist. By any stretch of the imagination, he was not a socialist. He was a fascist with his own unique brand of fascism. So when I fight fascism, I know who my enemy is. I know that I'm going after people who are trying to establish their own supremacy, and in many cases those who look to a kind of imaginary past when white people, for instance, were dominant. So a lot of American fascists will talk about the good old days, the days when white people ruled. Maybe the 1950s, maybe the 1960s, maybe even earlier. American fascism is a very different animal from Italian fascism. But American fascists, like Italian fascists, want to go back to that past. And what they will frequently do is they will blame a particular segment of the population for their loss of power. So in the US, that can be Jews, that can be Muslims, that can be African Americans, that can be Asian Americans or others. Anybody who does not fit the ideal of a white person in the way in which they defined it. And of course the term white is a very malleable term. It has changed in definition numerous times since it was first used during Southern slavery as simply a way of establishing white supremacy over slaves. Now it's used in a somewhat broader sense, but always with a sense of supremacy and authority over the downtrodden, over those who are subaltern or marginalized in American society. So I think that by reflecting upon one's own environment and asking what kinds of corruption, especially authoritarian corruption, exists in your area, you can figure out how to apply Antifa to your area. Now, how does that relate to third worldism? Not much. I mean, if you're living in the first world, there's very limited amounts of stuff that you can do to bring about communism in the third world. Most of your activity is going to be centered in the first world. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Any kind of effort to alleviate human suffering, to protect the interests of minorities, as long as that is not seen as an end in itself, is good. The problem with progressivism, so-called, is that it sees the alleviation of the suffering of the downtrodden as an end in itself. That is what they're trying to do. Like Bernie Sanders, for example, the fight for 15. What is he fighting for? Even when he said it, a family making $15 an hour is broke in most parts of the country. You cannot live a decent life on $15 an hour. You are right on the edge of poverty, if not deeply enmeshed in poverty, on $15 an hour. So when he was saying that, I was thinking about, where is this guy coming from? The fight for 15? In other words, what he's doing is precisely what Karl Marx talked about. He is begging for breadcrumbs from the capitalists. In effect, he's saying, okay, I accept the fact that capitalism is the reality of the world that we live in today. But, dear capitalists, please at least raise the amount of money that you are giving to the average person. Isn't that nice? Progressivism is a failed ideology. It does not lead to progress. It really doesn't lead anywhere. It's stagnation. It's simply a way of giving the capitalists exactly what they want and not challenging them beyond what they are willing to accept. So Bernie Sanders, who actually at one time, go back 30, 35 years, used to call himself a democratic socialist. And back then he was a democratic socialist. He was not a Marxist, but he was a democratic socialist. No longer. He is a progressive, or what would be called in most parts of the world, a social democrat. And that's it. Nothing more than that. So people who think that Bernie Sanders, AOC, and people like them are democratic socialists, and then they go around and they say, oh, I agree with them. I guess I'm a democratic socialist. They are totally misguided. So, fighting for the liberation of the oppressed, of the othered, of the marginalized, of the subaltern, of the proletariat. Fighting against capitalist interests, ingrained capitalist interests. Doing those kinds of things is anti-fascism. And those are good things to do. They aren't perfect. They certainly are not the ultimate answer to the problems which exist in the Western world, assuming that the Western world even continues, which I am very doubtful of personally. Look at the things that are happening around the world today. We may just blow ourselves up. Hopefully the third world will still be around, to build a communistic society. So that's my first suggestion, is looking around, seeing what kinds of things that you might do, whether it's corruption, which is something I'm focusing on. This area where I live in, the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, is extraordinarily corrupt. People who live here call it the spillover effect for Mexico, because this area was at one time essentially a suburb of Mexico. Even now, the roads leading outside of the Rio Grande Valley are not interstates. You go through small towns to get out of the area. Now that will change within a couple of years, but up till now, hasn't changed. We are still living in a relatively isolated place, very, very profoundly corrupt. And there really is not much that anybody that I know of can do about it. So I don't know what people are talking about when they discuss or bring up the idea that somehow we have figured out a way around capitalism. We can fight it. We can fight corruption. No, we can't. Corruption is so much a part of the Western experience, and especially the American experience, and I would argue that the United States is literally the most corrupt country in the world. It is the empire. There's not much that we can do here in the United States and in most other Western countries to fend off the threat of capitalism. Now, let me go on to the second suggestion that I have. And pardon me while I look off to the left side, because I have this thing written out in one of my books. And unfortunately, there is a Portuguese word which I cannot pronounce. And so when we get to that word, I'm going to play the MP3 file for it. I hope it comes through on the mic. Let's just cross our fingers and hope it comes through. Pragmatically, we can do a lot. The Portuguese term, now I'll play the MP3 file.
Conscientização.
Hope you heard that.
Conscientização.
Yeah, pronounced twice. That is anglicized as conscientization. I like the way this guy says it, so I'll play you his pronunciation followed by mine. I like his voice.
Conscientization. Conscientization.
First was his, second was mine. I like his a lot better. Now, let me read what I have here. That word, which in English is conscientization, is taken from the work of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. He lived from 1921 till 1997. The coinage was based on the French word conscience, which is spelled just like conscience is in English. It can be translated, however, as either conscience or consciousness. There is no separate word in French for consciousness. So when in French you say conscience, you can mean either one. And I think that's kind of cool, because actually in some cases you can say conscience, and basically the implication is both your consciousness and your moral conscience should be positioned in a certain way. So I actually like the French word conscience, which has a broader definition than the English word conscience. For historical or linguistic reasons unknown to this writer, I'm not a linguist, there is no corresponding French version of the English language consciousness. In the women's liberation movement of the 1960s, 1970s, conscientization was commonly referred to as consciousness raising. Those of you as old as me, and I doubt many people listening to this are as old as I am, but if you are, if you remember the women's liberation movement, or you've read about it or seen videos about it, you know something about consciousness raising. There were bra burnings, for example. Women would get together and would talk about how they could fight off patriarchy, male rulership. And that was all based upon the concept of conscientization as it was developed by Paulo Freire, and Paulo Freire's methodology was referred to by him as critical pedagogy, because Paulo Freire was an educator. He taught high school primarily, so his focus was on education, but using the educational system as a way to raise the consciousness of his students so that his students would gain a sense of the oppression of those less fortunate in his country of Brazil. For those of us residing in the first world, and I assume that's most of you, but especially individuals in the third world, we can engage in conscientization as a Maoist, third worldist praxis. Going back to that word praxis again, which basically is practice, but it's practice informed by theory. On a personal level, one of the ways in which I regularly immerse myself in that important praxis is through podcasting, what I'm doing right now. Perhaps each of us might reflect upon some manners in which we might apply our own particular talents and interests to conscientization. Now, I am certainly not in a position to speak for any of you. I don't know what interests you have. That's something for you to reflect upon. Reflection, I think, is extremely important for Marxists. We need to always be engaged in reflection on how we can do whatever we can to bring about transformation, to bring about conscientization. Now, even though I am sitting here in Mission, Texas, 3 miles north of Mexico, I imagine that there are some people in the third world who are listening to me, maybe in Mexico, wherever. YouTube is a global operation. So by engaging in podcasting, not only am I having an impact upon the first world, but hopefully I'm having an impact on the third world as well. I don't know. I haven't done a survey of it, and I wouldn't know how to do it anyway. But that is, I think, an even better way, maybe, than Antifa for engaging in the kind of conscientization which would actually have an impact upon the world, the kind of praxis that would actually have an impact on the world. Antifa is fine, but it's more limited, it's more localized. This is not. Podcasting is not limited or localized. You make a podcast, you upload it to YouTube, to TikTok, to Twitch, wherever. And your podcast can be seen anywhere in the world. And you might very well be contributing to conscientization. In other words, you might be contributing potentially to global revolution. That is how I see what I am doing. Now, your skills may not lie with podcasting. I have a background in radio. I used to work as a professional radio newscaster. My bachelor's degree is in journalism. I left it, got a master's in Ph.D. in sociology, but I would have stayed in it. The problem is the pay is so horrible. Unless you get into network or a major market station, and even there it's not that great. The pay is so awful that I thought, how am I going to pay back my student loans? That's what I thought. And so I decided, well, regrettably, I can't do this. I will find other ways in the future, I hope, what I'm doing now, for example, to use my radio training skills. And I've done it in additional ways as well, including, for example, back when I lived in Macon, Georgia, I worked for the Georgia Radio Reading Service for the blind and print handicapped, and I did newscasts for people who were blind and print handicapped. That's also a good thing to do. Nothing wrong with that. That is a kind of praxis, serving people who are disadvantaged. It's not on the same level as podcasting, where your voice can be heard around the world, but it's something. But if that's not your thing, then find something else. Sit down, lay back. What I suggest to people is that they breathe deeply, maybe lay down, and come up with something that you can do that will help the world move past its present stagnation. That is, I think, what we should all be doing. To work on conscientization and to develop our own praxis. It doesn't have to be like anybody else's. It can be entirely your own invention. Something that will help the world move forward. This is Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.